The first global corporation was not built on innovation, fair competition, or efficiency. It was built on monopoly, coercion, and a state-sanctioned right to use violence. Long before modern stock exchanges, before corporate law, before the language of free trade even existed, one company discovered something far more powerful than supply and demand. It learned how to fuse capital and force into a single system and then sell pieces of that system to investors. Most people are taught that capitalism developed organically, that markets evolved naturally from voluntary exchange, becoming more refined as societies grew more rational. That story is comforting, but incomplete, because the financial system we live inside today did not begin with freedom. It began with control. Welcome to The Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it appears. To understand how modern capitalism truly works, you have to trace it back to something that now sits quietly in a kitchen cabinet, something most people scatter without a second thought. Spices. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, spices were not decorative luxuries. They were strategic assets. Nutmeg, cloves, mace, cinnamon. These were preservatives in a world without refrigeration, medicines in a world without antibiotics, and symbols of status in rigid social hierarchies. In Europe, a small pouch of nutmeg could be worth more than its weight in gold. To control spices was not just to earn wealth. It was to reshape entire economies. The problem was geography. Nearly all valuable spices came from a tiny cluster of islands in Southeast Asia. Whoever controlled those islands controlled supply, and whoever controlled supply controlled prices. At first, European powers competed openly. Portuguese ships raced Dutch ships. Merchants undercut one another. Profits swung wildly. Some voyages returned unimaginable riches. Others came back with nothing but corpses and debt. Trade was fragmented, volatile, and brutally inefficient. That instability frightened investors, but it terrified merchants even more. Whenever one trader flooded Europe with spices, prices collapsed. When prices collapsed, profits vanished. Competition may have benefited consumers in theory, but in practice it was disastrous for the people funding these expeditions. So, the Dutch made a radical decision, one that permanently altered the relationship between money and power. Instead of competing, they consolidated. In 1602, the Dutch state merged several rival trading firms into a single entity, the Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC. On the surface, it looked like a financial breakthrough. The company issued public shares. Investors could buy ownership, spread risk, and trade those shares without ever stepping onto a ship. For the first time, ordinary citizens could invest in overseas expansion. But that wasn't the real innovation. The true innovation came next. The Dutch government granted the VOC a monopoly over all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. No Dutch merchant could legally compete with it. No rival company could operate in its territory. And unlike modern corporations, the VOC wasn't merely allowed to trade, it was allowed to govern. It could wage war. It could construct forts. It could negotiate treaties. It could imprison enemies. It could execute smugglers. This was not a company operating under a state. It was a company functioning as the state, with shareholders. Nothing says free market quite like outlawing everyone else. Once monopoly was secured, profit mechanics became brutally simple. Control supply. Limit output. Keep prices high. Anyone who threatened that Banasa wasn't a competitor, they were a problem. On islands like Banda, the world's sole source of nutmeg at the time, the VOC enforced exclusivity with military precision. Local populations were ordered to sell only to the company, at prices dictated by the company. Resistance wasn't met with negotiation. It was met with destruction. Villages were burned. Entire communities were slaughtered. Survivors were enslaved or displaced, replaced by forced labor, imported to maintain production. Nutmeg trees were deliberately destroyed, not because they were worthless, but because abundance threatened profits. Scarcity was not a flaw of the system. It was the system. Back in Amsterdam, investors saw none of this. They didn't need to. Their experience of the VOC was clean and abstract. Steady dividends, rising share prices, perfectly balanced books. The violence stayed overseas. The profits came home. And this separation between profit and consequence may be the VOC's most enduring contribution to financial history. For the first time, thousands of people could profit from imperial violence without participating in it, witnessing it, or even acknowledging it. Risk became abstract. Responsibility became diluted. Ownership was reduced to paper. By the time the money arrived, the blood was already off the books. This was capitalism learning how to scale. The VOC didn't merely trade spices. It perfected a system where brutality could be converted into returns, where force became dividends, and where moral costs disappeared beneath bureaucracy and distance. Investors didn't need to believe in conquest. They only needed to believe in yield, and for a time, it worked extraordinarily well. The Dutch Republic grew wealthy. Amsterdam emerged as a global financial hub. The VOC became the most powerful company on earth, with a valuation that would eclipse many modern corporations. It paid dividends for decades. It survived wars, uprisings, and scandals, and it left behind a blueprint others were eager to copy, because once the world realized that monopoly, backed by state power, could produce predictable profit, the idea could not be unseen. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because the VOC was not an anomaly. It was a prototype. What made the VOC truly revolutionary was not just its wealth, but how it made wealth feel legitimate. For decades, it delivered what investors valued most: predictability, controlled supply, legal protection, political backing. The chaos of conquest was absorbed by bureaucracy and transformed into balance sheets. Violence became overhead, exploitation became logistics. Empire became a line item, and here, the logic of the financial system quietly changed. Before the VOC, trade was personal. Merchants faced the risks they took. Losses were immediate. Profits were earned face-to-face with danger. The VOC introduced distance, geographic, moral, and psychological. Shareholders didn't need to understand Southeast Asia. They didn't need to know the Banda Islands. They didn't even need to know what nutmeg looked like growing on a tree. They only needed to know the return. That separation changed everything. Profit no longer depended on accountability. It depended on structure, on rules written by those who benefited from them, on monopolies enforced by law and violence. Capital learned it could grow faster when it no longer had to confront its consequences directly. Other European powers followed. Chartered companies spread, British, French, and beyond. Each granted monopolies, each backed by the state, each blurring the boundary between commerce and sovereignty. The idea of markets as neutral arenas of exchange gave way to a harder truth. Markets are tools, shaped by those with the power to design them, yet the story sold to investors remained consistent. These ventures were framed as progress, as trade, as civilization expanding outward. Language softened reality. Numbers replaced names, returns replaced lives. Eventually, the VOC declined. Corruption spread, bureaucracy bloated, costs rose, control weakened. By the late 18th century, the company collapsed under its own weight and was nationalized in 1799. On paper, it failed, but its logic endured, because the VOC's true legacy was not its lifespan. It was its structure. Modern financial systems still rely on the same core mechanisms: distance between decision and consequence, abstraction of risk, concentration of power disguised as efficiency. Profits are privatized. Costs are distributed across workers, regions, and generations. The tools have changed. The language is cleaner. The violence is often less visible, but the incentives remain strikingly familiar. When corporations receive regulatory protection, when competition quietly disappears behind legal barriers, when complexity shields accountability, when profit depends more on access than innovation, you are seeing echoes of the VOC. Not history repeating, but history evolving. This is why free markets are often more myth than reality. Markets are not natural phenomena. They are constructed, designed, enforced, and the rules are rarely neutral. They reflect power, who holds it, who preserves it, and who benefits from its protection. Understanding this doesn't require it requires clarity. The VOC was not uniquely evil for its era. It was brutal because brutality was profitable, and because the system rewarded it. Systems do not produce outcomes by accident. They produce outcomes through incentives, and incentives do not care about intentions. Capitalism is not a force of nature, like gravity or weather. It is a human design, and like all human designs, it reflects the values and power structures of its creators. The danger is not that markets exist. The danger is forgetting how they were shaped. And why? When you forget the origins, you start believing the slogans. You assume fairness where there is advantage, neutrality where there is design, freedom where there is constraint, and that belief makes you vulnerable. Financial education is not about memorizing definitions or predicting crises. It is about recognizing patterns of power, seeing how profit and authority intertwine, understanding that wealth has always flowed toward those who control systems, not merely those who participate in them. The VOC understood this for centuries ago. That is why it was so effective, and that is why its shadow still stretches across the modern financial world. The lesson here is not that capitalism is broken or that markets are evil. It is more precise and more useful. Capitalism was never neutral. It was engineered. And once you see the engineering, you stop mistaking outcomes for accidents. History does not repeat because it must. It repeats because the incentives remain familiar and because every generation believes it is finally operating within a different system. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History holds the answers. I'll show you where to look.